episode in the series of videos I'm making covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't seen the previous 5 videos, I'd recommend going to the #HisTV YouTube channel and watching those first. So far in this series, I've covered the 1920s, the origins of the Great Depression as well. Our big question today is, how successfully did Roosevelt's New Deal solve the problems of the Great Depression? You hopefully would have seen the previous video where we looked at the 1932 election and how Roosevelt's promise of a New Deal for the American people allowed him to win the 1932 election by around 7 million votes. So we're going to have a look at the New Deal policies today. We're going to think about their successes in dealing with the Great Depression and the economic crisis created by the Wall Street crash starting in 1929. And then we're going to look forward to think about some of the remaining issues for America at the end of Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Now, there are 5 key areas that I'm going to be discussing as part of my attempts to explain the successes of the New Deal. We're going to begin by Roosevelt's 100 days. That's the first 100 days that he had as President of America. We're also going to have a look specifically at some of the policies that came part of the New Deal. We're also going to have a look at the growing criticism of the New Deal, and then how Roosevelt's second set of policies, known as the Second New Deal, may be sought to solve some of the remaining problems. We're going to have a look at American society in the 1930s and something called popular culture. And finally, we're then going to have an overall look at the impact of the New Deal on American society. Now, when you're trying to remember the priorities of Roosevelt in his New Deal policies, there are 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Those are the 3 things that Roosevelt was trying to do for America through his New Deal policies. Relief is all about giving immediate action to help those most in need, the unemployed people living in slums around the cities, and to find employment for those people as well. Recovery. These are the programs that are going to help America recover from the Great Depression. And so Roosevelt put together a series of programs to restart the economy, to get America moving again. And then finally, reform. Reform or change. These are the changes that are going to prevent future economic problems. This is reforming of the banking system. This is reforming of the way that American governments deal with employment and welfare. So those are the 3 things that were really helpful to remember when you're studying the New Deal. Let's begin by looking at Roosevelt's first 100 days as President of America. So firstly, Roosevelt worked with a close team of advisors known as the Brains Trust to make a plan for America's recovery, and he was not afraid to seek advice from the experts. If you think about America's previous president, Herbert Hoover, one of the big criticisms that was aimed at him is that he refused to listen to the experts. Roosevelt was very different, and he wanted to take an active role in encouraging other people that knew more than he did to help with America's recovery. Secondly, he closed all the banks in America. Huge number of banks had gone bankrupt in the start of the 1930s. He closed all of the banks, and then what he got the government to do was to check these banks. 5,000 of these were then allowed to reopen, but only the ones that were trustworthy and stable. He also put money aside to support these banks in the hope that people would begin trusting the banks again, putting their money back into the banks, and that would enable banks to give loans to businessmen and get America's economy going again. Finally, then, in his first 100 days, he knew that he had to restore the trust of the American people. Again, if you think back to America's previous president, Hoover, he was seen as a do-nothing president. He was accused of ignoring the problems that America faced at the beginning of the Great Depression. And so Roosevelt tried really, really hard to connect with the people. And so he delivered a radio broadcast from his living room, known as a fireside chat, every Sunday, explaining what the government was doing, but also other things like his favorite history topics, the fall of Rome, for example. And so this started to help Roosevelt reconnect with the people, and around 60 million people were tuning into this radio show every week. So we've thought about Roosevelt's 100 days, his first 100 days as president. Let's look more specifically at some of the policies that make up what we call the New Deal. So in 1933, Roosevelt's first New Deal aimed to meet the urgent needs of America. Remember the 3 R's, this is all about relief. Roosevelt set up something called alphabet agencies to help solve a range of problems. They're called alphabet agencies because they have lots of long, complicated names, but they are kind of reduced down to acronyms like FDR or the PWA or the CCC or the TVA. FDR, for example, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, spent $500 million on soup kitchens, blankets, and nurseries, helping poor, unemployed, and homeless people, and then providing nurseries so that women could also start to work again. The PWA, or Public Works Administration, created millions of jobs in building schools and dams and roads and more. And that, again, both gives employment to unemployed people, but also starts to rebuild America's infrastructure. There are many other alphabet agencies, and I'd recommend looking and doing some research on others so that you have enough information about those to take into the exam with you. The second part of the New Deal policies was that maybe it wasn't doing enough. By 1935, just a couple of years into these policies, the New Deal was being criticised for failing to do enough to help America recover. Now, 1936 was a re-election year, or an election year. Roosevelt hoped that he'd be re-elected, and so he needed to persuade the American people that they should choose him again. And so in 1935, he got together with his advisors and he released something called the Second New Deal, a second set of policies to continue the work of the First New Deal, but to solve the problems that had not already been dealt with. The Wagner Act was part of the Second New Deal, and this enforced employers to allow trade unions to operate in their companies. Trade unions protect the rights of workers, ensure they're being paid well enough, ensures that their working conditions are safe. And so this act is forcing employers to help their employees. Something called the Social Security Act was also passed in Congress, and it provided pensions and support for the sick and disabled. So Roosevelt was introducing these big sweeping programs to look after the welfare of the American people on a scale never seen before. So we've looked at Roosevelt's first 100 days and then some of the policies that made up his New Deal. It's also really important to remember, though, that there were some people who did not support the New Deal policies, and they were critics. They opposed the New Deal. Unemployment did remain high. America was recovering very slowly from the effects of the Great Depression, and this led different groups of people to criticize Roosevelt and his New Deal for lots of different reasons. The Supreme Court, the highest court in America, declared that parts of the New Deal were unconstitutional, against the laws of America, and they said that Roosevelt had gone too far. In response, Roosevelt threatened to add 6 judges to the Supreme Court who would vote in his favor, something known as stacking the court. But the Supreme Court is one of the big parts of the American kind of legal system, and so it looked like Roosevelt was acting like a dictator, taking control of the Supreme Court and essentially taking control of the law himself. Now, the Supreme Court did back down. They accepted many of Roosevelt's New Deal policies, but this is clearly one of the big criticisms leveled at Roosevelt. Republicans also didn't like the New Deal. They argued that the New Deal was doing too much, interfering too much in the lives of the people. Remember, in the 1920s, their laissez-faire policy was one of the key factors for the boom in the first place. And laissez-faire policy is the idea that you don't interfere. And so the New Deal was really seen to be interfering too much. Some Republicans felt the New Deal encouraged laziness because it helped people who weren't contributing to American society. So that was the idea that the New Deal did too much. There were also some people, like radical politician Huey Long, who argued that the New Deal was not doing enough. It wasn't going far enough to help the people, it was moving too slowly. And so Huey Long had his own program that he wanted it to be introduced called Share Our Wealth, where taxes would be shared between all Americans. Now, he was seen by some as a communist. He was assassinated just a few years later, but clearly he had other ideas that the New Deal was doing not enough to help the people. So we've got criticisms from the Supreme Court and from the people that thought Roosevelt was acting like a dictator, criticisms from the Republicans saying that the New Deal was doing too much, and the criticisms from radical politicians like Huey Long, who said that it was not doing enough. Now, in the middle of all these policies, in the middle of Roosevelt's New Deal, we also need to take a quick look at the popular culture of the time, the kind of things that the American people were doing when they did have a bit more money and when they did have their free time. So firstly, radio. Radios continued to be incredibly popular in the 1930s for the whole family, and by 1939, 28 million homes had a radio. Companies continued to advertise their products on the radio, as we saw in the 1920s, and things like soap operas and dramas were broadcast weekly on the radio, attracting millions of listeners and making celebrities and stars out of these actors. Sport also continued to be really, really popular. Baseball and basketball continued to be the two most popular sports. The Harlem Globetrotters basketball team became world famous. And some teams at this time were encouraging women to join and visit their stadiums by giving them free tickets. Sports events and sports games became a family event. And cinema attendance grew in the 1930s, just as it was doing in the 1920s. Many films that were made in the 1930s reflected the American experience of the Great Depression and the recovery afterwards. People really connected with the topics that were being told in these films. Films like Swing Time and The Grapes of Wrath both told stories of American people experienced difficult times, but then recovering afterwards. To finish today then, let's have a look at the overall impact of the New Deal on American society, some of the successes, but some of the problems that still remained afterwards. Firstly then, the American people did start to trust their government again. Millions of jobs were created, mainly for working men. The New Deal supported trade unions and the rights of workers. So for people who were working in these big American businesses, their rights were generally more supported during New Deal policies. And the banking system was stabilised and supported businesses. It was reformed in a way to help maybe stop this from happening again. So there was some progress. In terms of welfare, the New Deal helped people on a scale that had never been seen before. Roosevelt was the first president to invest all this money in welfare projects for ordinary people. And so presidents after Roosevelt had very similar policies that were going to help people. Schools, roads, power stations were built as part of the New Deal, and this improved the general standard of living in many deprived and poor areas of America. So clearly there was some progress. On the other hand, though, economic recovery was very slow. By 1941, there were still 6 million people unemployed, and many of the economic problems that faced these people had not been solved. The New Deal also focused a lot on white working men. The New Deal failed to help most African Americans and other minority groups. Many of the New Deal agencies discriminated against African Americans who got no work, or if they did receive work, they got lower wages. It wasn't until World War II that America truly recovered from the Great Depression, and so some criticism of Roosevelt's New Deal was perhaps that it led to a really slow economic recovery. There we have it then. So that's the end of the video on Roosevelt's successes of the New Deal policies. We've looked at his 100 days, the initial things he did to start the economy rolling again and to restore the trust of the people. We've looked specifically at the New Deal policies and the alphabet agencies. We've looked more widely at the different criticisms that Roosevelt and his New Deal faced. We've looked at popular culture in the 1930s, the continuing rise of the radio and sports and cinema, and then finally an overall view of the New Deal, that there was some economic recovery, but it was very slow and excluded large groups of American people, including African Americans and other minorities. Thanks for watching.